Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session entitled Economic Interdependence Session. My name is Don Moon. I'm the moderator of today's session. Today's session is sponsored by Korean Foundation and one of the panels organized under the the International Studies Association. And then we welcome everyone for today's session. We have 3 presenters and 3 discussants for this session, but unfortunately, there had been some technical issues we had to consider, so that there may be some changes in the order of today's presentation. I just want to introduce 3 presenters to this session. The first one is Professor Wang Yang and Professor Katada Saori, and then Professor Son Ki-young, because we have connections from Japan as well as China, so we need some arrangements for making this network working smoothly. So changing the order of this presentation in this, the proposal, we are having a first presentation from Professor Son Ki-young from Korea University. As you've seen in the titles of this session, this one is Weaponized Interdependence and Economic Relations of East Asia. So we have one from the perspective of Japan, and another from the perspectives of China, and the third one, perspective from South Korea. So the final presentation, Professor Son Ki-young, and he is dealing with that the danger and risks that we are witnessing and emerging kind of situations in East Asia from South Korea's perspectives. So first the presentation will be Professor Son Ki-young's. And as for the organization issues, we have a total of 2 hours, so that I assign about 30 minutes for each paper. So 20 minutes for presenters and 10 minutes for discussant. And the final 30 minutes will be some response from the presenters again, as well as it's open for a floor, so that there had been some feedback from an open space. So Professor Son Ki-young, welcome, and now is your first presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Moon, for your kind introduction. And also thank you very much, actually, Professor Lee Yong-wook, who is not here at the moment, for inviting me to this prestigious session. Actually, we are putting together scholars from China, Japan, and South Korea. So this is a really good way of discussing the possibilities of regional cooperation and integration. And actually, my paper is basically focused on, I can say, regional integration. Actually, in the time of crisis or contingencies, because we are using kind of what we call interdependence as kind of a weapon in terms of fighting. Therefore, we are in a sense in a state of war, but it's kind of economic war. Therefore, in a sense, the best way to overcome the current problems and perhaps promote a better possibility of a future cooperation, we need to think about some kind of innovative ideas, and that's why I'm going to suggest some strategies for mutual prosperity in East Asia at the end of the presentation. Okay, so basically, let me first tell you about the weaponized interdependence. In East Asia, basically the weaponization of interdependence is another reality. If you remember, in 2010, China imposed actually sanctions against Japan by restricting export of rare earth materials. And this action was taken because the 2 countries were involved in territorial dispute over Senkaku Ryukyu Island. Again, in 2016, when the United States and South Korea decided to deploy what we call THAAD, anti-missile defense system in South Korea. China also launched large-scale sanctions against South Korea, especially Lotte, the company which provided land to the site for deployment of THAAD missiles, were subject to heavy, actually, penalties and sanctions by China. And also Chinese government banned Chinese, actually, tourists traveling to South Korea, causing huge, actually, monetary losses for South Korean tourism industry. So, if we are involved in this kind of sanctions, and also sometimes, counter sanctions or counter tax, what we are eventually going to see is the rising antagonism between or among the countries involved. So actually, I will introduce a short survey which was conducted actually earlier this year by Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And in March, actually, in South Korea, among a representative of a national sample of 1,000 adults, 83% of those responding to the surveys said China is more of a security threat, with just 12% saying it's more of a security partner. You can suddenly a changing atmosphere between the two nation states, and China has become increasingly hostile to many South Koreans. So if you see the next line, on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most favorable, China had mean score of 3.6, on par with North Korea with a 3.5 and Japan with a 3.7. So that means, the three major neighbors of South Korea, China, North Korea, Japan, are all recording, in a sense, very serious, points here. If you compare this with the score of United States, which stood at 6.4. So that means, we can say South Koreans have a very favorable attitude toward the United States, whereas regarding China, North Korea, Japan, as kind of a possible security threat. So, but in the case of China, basically, in the same poll 2 years ago, China scored at 4.8. That means it reflects drastic drop in the South Koreans' favorable attitude toward China. And also, in the relations between South Korea and Japan, anti-Japanese sentiment has sharply risen in Korea in August 2019, right after Japan announced the export restrictions. An estimated 50,000 retail shops in South Korea pledged to join a campaign to boycott Japanese products, such as, for example, Asahi beer. So therefore, what I'm going to actually say in this paper is that the weaponization of interdependence is actually self-destructive or mutually destructive, and we need to conceive a better way of handling our international economic life. So what I'm going to say in this paper is I will first look at the connection between war and nationalism, and then I will try to define what we call semiconductor nationalism or techno-nationalism. Then I'm going to proceed to case study. I will basically look at trade war between Korea and Japan over semiconductor issues. Finally, I will propose the creation of an East Asian semiconductor community, like European core and steel community, as one of the long-term initiatives for preventing the supply chain disturbances and promoting East Asian integration. Nevertheless, the mechanism I'm proposing, called the EASC, is an ideal type as a form of a complex interdependence, and it's not really attainable shortly because there is no able agency and favorable structure. Okay, let's look at first the idea of complex interdependence. It's already very well-known idea. According to Keohane, actually he developed the notion of complex interdependence as a form of a fragmented polity in which there were multiple actors rather than just state, and multiple issues that were not necessarily hierarchically ordered, and force and the threat of force were not valuable tools of policy. So basically, European Union is, in a sense, a realized form of complex interdependence in terms of multiple agencies, and we don't see any possibility of armed conflict between France and Germany anymore. And when actually Keohane was defining complex interdependence, he is actually treating this as a kind of an ideal type, and therefore the realities unfolding are somewhere in between, depending on regions and issue areas. So, as I said, I will first look at the connection between war and nationalism. Basically, when we are talking about war, we cannot have to, actually, the first person that comes to my mind is actually Karl von Clausewitz. He is known for his definition of war as continuation of policy by other means. And Clausewitz addressed solely, however, the armed conflicts between nation states. And in the 21st century, Rosa Brooks actually argued there is no boundary between peace and war, and globalization has created a world in which everything became war against enemies, changing constantly. So basically, Rosa Brooks' idea of war is more applicable to current discussion of semiconductor nationalism or techno nationalism. And because of time limits, I will skip some part. So basically, in this third decade of 21st century is marked by the resurgence of nationalism, as many international trade issues have been politicized and even securitized to the extent that many governments have weaponized their structural advantages for coercive use against the targeted state. So in this world where unprecedented levels of interdependence are combined with the nationalist and hegemonic struggles, many states are prone to employ all measures short of war. So let me define techno-nationalism or semiconductor nationalism. So basically, even undying in this age of globalization, nationalism has permeated economic warfare between nation states in the 21st century, especially, as you know, the production of semiconductors, the basic components of modern digital life used for everything from artificial intelligence to smartphones has become the world's most important industry, with a total sales volume amounting to 412 billion US dollars in 2019. So since they are known as the building blocks for future innovation and perhaps one of the key variables determining the fate of current hegemonic struggles between United States and China, as well as competition of major industrial powers, including European Union, Japan, and South Korea, semiconductors emerged as one of the key national security issues. So the securitization of semiconductor manufacturing and sales led to government intervention in business decisions over where to manufacture chips and to whom to sell them. Basically, if you look at the policy of Trump administration or Biden administration, they are trying to attract many, manufacturing factories to the United States. So they are deeply involved in deciding where to produce, microchips and other semiconductor products. So as more and more countries became concerned with the security of digital infrastructure as well as G5 and supply chains, techno-nationalism or semiconductor nationalism gained traction across the world. So this is actually global chip industries. As you know, United States, especially Intel, Micron, Qualcomm, these are biggest, semiconductor companies. And if you look at East Asia, basically Samsung and TSMC are among the largest. And also we have some companies in Europe, though much smaller than American and East Asian companies. And also what we should not forget here is China is the largest market of semiconductors. So in a sense, there's no monopoly of semiconductor industry. This means actually global interdependence or division of labor achieved, in the production, distribution of, semiconductors. So let me now tell you about the current dispute between Japan and South Korea. And actually, there was an escalating tit-for-tat between the two countries over the last 2 years. And because I don't have much time left, I will skip some part. But this actually current dispute started in 2018 when South Korean Supreme Court ordered Nippon Steel, a Japanese steelmaker, to repay 100 million won in World War era debts, each to 4 Korean forced laborers for the first time in history. And this ruling allowed for seizure of Nippon Steel assets, starting the procedures to auction off Japanese firms' shares in a Korea-based venture with POSCO, a South Korean steelmaker. So this actually made the Japanese government get intervened in this issue because a Japanese company is running the risk of some of its assets, auctioned off by the South Korean government. So the trade war started in July 2019 when Japanese METI, the Ministry of Economic and Trade and Industry, imposed the restrictions on the export of 3 key high-tech materials. Japan actually has dominated globally. They are, high purity hydrogen fluoride, which is often called etching gas, and then photoresist and fluorinated polyimide. So these 3 materials are key materials for production of semiconductor products. And also, Japan downgraded South Korea from its white list of preferred trading countries in August 2019. So if we go back to the title of my paper, is it really weapon or default option? But somehow, if you look at the last sentence, actually Japanese government didn't apply these restrictions very strictly. They made actually gave permissions to export of their products to South Korean companies on a case-by-case basis. So that means somehow Japan's government action looks like a kind of default action because it had to respond to South Korean government action in terms of, damaging, the assets of Japanese company. Perhaps this is already quite well known. I will skip this part. Anyway, we all know Korea, actually, it's not just one-way dependency between Korea and Japan. What I'm saying here is that Korea and Japan are actually interdependent in terms of producing semiconductors. And in the initial stage of the bilateral dispute, South Korea faced a crisis because its reserves of these key materials are running out shortly. However, South Korea actually took action to, in a sense, retaliate by declaring to terminate GSOMIA. This is a military information sharing agreement bilaterally between Japan and South Korea. But at the end of the stage, actually, because of the intervention of the United States, South Korea postponed the termination of the agreement. And now what I'm saying is South Korea explored various ways to secure the supply of Japanese materials, but in a sense, in the initial stages, they all failed because of the intervention of Japanese government. However, 1 year after Japan's action, South Korea achieved kind of what you call localization and also diversification. So they, secured some materials from Europe and other sources. Also, some South Korean companies achieved in locally producing these key materials. And I am actually prepared this table showing, what has happened from 2019 to 2020. Basically, in terms of etchingas, the South Korea's dependency on Japan dramatically decreased from almost 44% to 12%, whereas the dependence on Japan over photoresist and fluorinated polyimide have not very changed because, in a sense, Japanese companies continued to supply these products to South Korea. And what happened after 2 years is basically many Japanese companies established actually their factories in Korea to guarantee the steady supply of these materials. So overall, what I'm going to say is basically South Korea partially succeeded in localization and diversification, and the problem is even after this localization and diversification, the South Korean industries are demanding actually closer cooperation between Japan and South Korea, because this is the best way of achieving mutual profits. And even though South Korea invested huge money in terms of what it's called the K semiconductor belt, but still what I analyze from this analysis is basically, South Korean industries are still partially dependent on Japanese, supply of these key materials, and so they are calling for closer cooperation. So what I'm saying is basically they are recording mutual loss. Therefore, the best way for future and the best, strategy for mutual prosperity in the future is basically, as I said at the outset, creation of an East Asian semiconductor community. So this idea is actually modeled after European coal and steel community. When actually Jean Monnet first tried to, conceive and develop this idea, he was not really internationalist or cosmopolitan. He was actually a patriot. That means that he first tried to restrict Germany's production of these key war materials. But facing US resistance, US pressure, and also Germany's resistance, he changed his strategies and promoted Franco-German cooperation. So that actually resulted in the creation of European coal and steel community. In the same way, perhaps, to secure stable supply chain of semiconductor products, what I'm saying here is perhaps we need to replicate the European experience in East Asia as well. Perhaps somehow maybe creating kind of a small-scale regional community. Maybe first, maybe Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Maybe in the future, it might be including China and other Southeast Asian countries. So this idea is not really realizable in this stage because of hegemonic competition between United States and China. But somehow, if we have a more favorable international structure, and perhaps we have a more able agent like Jean Monnet or maybe Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, then it's I think a time to think about possibility of creating East Asian semiconductor community. So I will stop here because the time is already running out. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ki-Young-Son. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we have a first presenter's presentation, and now I've checked that we have resolved all those technical problems. So actually, this session is broadcasted and recorded on a YouTube, and then these two presenters, one from Japan, one from China, and the one discussants, they all joining this session on some internet, so that at the beginning of the session, we have some technical problems to check whether everybody is joining this session correctly. Now, I've heard from the staff that, okay, they all joining here. So I want to repeat again, okay, for introducing all for this session. So firstly, from Professor Wang Yong, Beijing University. Hi, are you there? And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, my name is Don Moon, the moderator of today's session. And welcome and thank you for joining for today's session. And also, Professor Katada Saori.
Hi, good morning, is it? No, good afternoon. I am from Los Angeles, so it's in the 9 o'clock at night. But it's great to see you. I had a bit of a panic for a while, but now we are here, so that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so, okay, for resolving the technical problems of your connection, okay, we have to start from the first presentation, okay, Professor Son Ki-Young's about the Korea's perspectives. Now we are going back to the normal, okay, the procedures from a Beijing University, Professor Wang Yong, about a U.S.-China rivalry and the Chinese countermeasure issues first. As for some kind of organizational matter, we have about 2 hours in total. So for each presenter, you have 10 minutes of your presentation. And after the presentation, we have a 10 minutes designated discussion for each presentation. And after that, for the remaining time, it's open to floor so that we are gathering some questions and discussion points from audiences here. So I know that there had been some time gap for gathering questions from YouTube and Zoom. So if anyone who has any questions or there's some discussion points or adding, okay, whatever points, then you can, okay, you can type, okay, your comments or discussion points at the Zoom menu so that we can gather all those questions and then ask, okay, that the presenters at the end of this session. Okay, now, Professor Wang, it's your session, okay?
Okay, thank you. I would like to check with you. The presentation will be 10 minutes, right?
20 minutes will be okay.
10 minutes.
20.
20 minutes,
Okay.
okay. Thank you. I would like to share my slides. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Not yet. Please try again.
Okay.
Now it's working.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation and to join this distinguished panel. I also think the topic is very timely and important for all of us, the securitization of economic interdependence. I would like to present a Chinese perspective mainly my own perspective about this topic, focus on China and US strategic competition and China's countermeasures. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to, by the way, I'm looking forward to the listening to the perspective of Japan, Korea, the US, all the other the representatives. Okay, that will be a great learning process. First of all, I'd like to speak a little bit about the concept of securitization of interdependence. Sorry. Yeah, we have seen the tremendous changes in the US and China relationship. And when the President Trump took office in 2017. In China, we have seen the relationship has been changed from one basically mainly on cooperation and mutual benefits, or the absolute gain, to the one that based on the competition and even the strategic competition and strategic rivalry between the US and China. The so-called the securitization of interdependence, in my understanding, that is refers to the one country takes the advantages of the other country's dependence on export market, the access to technology and the natural resources to enforce restrictions and denial measures in order to achieve its foreign policy and security goals. The instruments can be utilized to achieve foreign policy and security goals includes export control, the product lists, the entity list, or the company, the list, foreign investment control list, to restrict the access to the rival, the competitors, access to technology and capital, imposing tariff, manipulating international banking and financial network, such as a SWIFT system. A lot of people mentioned in the recent time. The US has a very long history of exercising this, the securitization of interdependence. The US has a very fully developed system of export control. They also, I think, in the last 20 years, we have increasing the power and influence of the US in this regard, especially in the international banking and the financial the network. So the people are talking about the dollar predominant position and to serve the US the foreign policy interests. So the targets of the US economic sanction is not limited to the countries like China, but also it's target US allies. The European countries, especially the Germany and the France, has suffered greatly from the US economic sanction measures in the recent decade. The second part, I would like to share my observations about the Trump administration's China policy, decoupling and new Cold War strategy. The Trump administration launched a Cold War against China since the 2018, imposing tariffs upon the Chinese technology company and research institutions, such as Huawei, on an export control list, entity list, restricting China's company access to US technology. It aimed to undermine China's economic and technology potential. So that we have, the very important the part of the great readjustment of restructuring the U.S.-China policy. It started in the Trump administration's revisions of the U.S. National Security Strategy Report, defining Russia and China as the major competitors and primary sources of security threats to the U.S. And one more the things about the redefinition of China. Okay, by June 2018, when the terrible war started, the Trump administration seems to define China as a greater threat to the national security of the U.S. and especially its global hegemony than Russia. So that we have the same, the U.S. It issued the Section 301 investigation report on China and started to impose tariff on the Chinese goods to the U.S. in June. And we have seen the collapse of the talks between the two countries. The talks is guided by the top leaders, the President Trump and China, and the President Xi Jinping, when both leaders met at the G20 side meeting in December 2018. After the ups and downs of negotiations, we have seen both parties signed the first phase deal in January 2020, just before the COVID-19 the crisis broke out. It is even worse. The first phase deal, the Trump administrations didn't stop building pressures on China, mainly along the lines of economic decoupling. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the Trump administration's hardliners, including the Secretary of State Pompeo, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, and others, grasped the chance to promote economic decoupling with China. They are the mainly policy, the instrument is to relocalize the global supply chain away from China in the name of ensuring the safety supply of epidemic prevention materials and the medicines. But in sense, it is aimed to promote the economic decoupling between China and the US. As a part of the efforts of economic decoupling, we have seen the US State Department launched what is called the Partnership for Economic Prosperity Initiative. Okay, that is an attempt to create a new economic partnership based on shared values of democracies, inviting the countries in Asia-Pacific region and Latin America to participate and excluding China. That is plan one. The plan two, as we was saying, there is called the Clean Network Initiative, a plan trying to drive the Chinese 5G technologies and equipments, as well as the Chinese internet companies' APPs of the internet. The example is the Huawei, ZTE, as well as Tencent, WeChat, and TikTok. So according to the State Department, when the new administrations throw in, there are about 43 countries so far has participated in the US so-called Clean the Network initiative. Okay, how to look at the results of the Trump administration's economic sanction on China? I think they produced a negative impact on both economies. The tariff war and technological restrictions has led to a negative impact on the economies of both China and the US. We are seeing reductions in China's exports to the US and the shrinking of the US trade deficits with China. However, the US trade deficit has not eased, but rather increased. But on the other hand, we are seeing the trade war hasn't done very much to help American economies. I see American enterprises and consumers has suffered greatly. Now we are seeing, okay, the latest investigation to show that a majority of the levies imposed by the Trump administrations has been taken, burned by the U.S. importers and consumers. So that is the American business. I call for the suspensions of ending the U.S. tariff measures on China. The COVID-19 and differences in the success of controlling the epidemic between China and U.S. has changed positions of the China-U.S., the two economies, in the global economy. The COVID-19 severely impacted the service-centered economy of the U.S., where more than 70% of GDP comes to the service sector. On the other hand, China has quickly brought the pandemic under control throughout the country, becoming the only major economy with positive economic growth in the 2020. The pandemic also demonstrated the strong international competitiveness of China's manufacturing industry. One more thing I would like to add. Okay, that is about the natures of the economic interdependence as a result of the last 3 decades of economic globalization in this region. The Trump administration's new Cold War policy toward China is constrained by the global and regional economic interdependence, has had limited success. The reason is that as China is the largest trading partner of almost all the Asia-Pacific countries, majority of Asia-Pacific countries are not willing to take sides between China and US and have resisted pressure from the US government over the past few years. Thirdly, I'd like to focus on the Biden administration's China policy and how to define its competition policy with China. Here, I would like to define it as something like the strategic competition within economic interdependence. After the Biden took office, US-China relations could tend to be a relationship of competitive competition, of the mixed competition and cooperations. And economic interdependence could be more complicated, used to preserve the relations to serve the US business interests in the Chinese markets, as well as to maintain the US predominance over China. The first point I'd like to share is different from the Trump administration approach on the economic technology decoupling between the two countries. The Biden administrations might tend to recognize the fact that the two economies are interdependent, and continuations of this economic and trade ties is of great benefit to the US economy as a whole, as well as to American producers and consumers. The second, the Biden administration is likely to focus its economic trade policy toward China, opening up the markets. So there is likely to propose in the short term removal of Trump's tariffs on the Chinese exports, but removal will not be without conditions, mainly in exchange for China doing more to open its markets. So we have seen the economic dialogue between the both governments has been resumed, but it's not yet to say the directions the economic dialogue will take. And it will be very important to understand the reasons why the US has taken initiative to reach out to China to resume the dialogue. A lot of discussions about the macroeconomic background of the US economy at this moment, especially the rising the inflation rate and its negative impact of the US economy. The third point is the US. They probably strengthen its international mechanism to regulate China's industrial policy behavior. The Biden puts particular emphasis on US leadership in multilateral institutions. So it's likely require further regulation of China's industry policies and subsidies reporting into the WTO, and great transparency and compliance with China's industry policy. Fourth, the Biden administration is likely to keep technology competition policy with China, even push for the further decoupling in order to curb China's technological advances. However, as the Biden administration represents the more interests of the US, the business community. The US business community demands that the US company should not lose their market shares in China because of excessive restrictions on the export of technological products to China. The technical restrictions on China should be reasonable and should not affect their interests in the Chinese markets. So the policy choice for the Biden administrations in the future will be to strike a balance between so-called great power competition considerations and the commercial interests of the US business community to continue to expand its market share in China. One possible the outcome from the American side will be to the tighten restrictions on technology in defense and defense industry, mostly closely related to the military technology, but loosen restrictions on the export of technology products in the non-military related technology sector and give American company more room to develop in China. And what about the China's response? Okay, now in the last several years, okay, Chinese economy has been put in the very difficult the position. Like other countries, China has also been affected by the impact of COVID-19 on the securities of China's industry and supply chains. But what's more, to compare with all the other countries, China has been pressured by the US strategic competition policy and technology decoupling, and pressure on China's supply chain security was much earlier and much greater. In view of the changing international environment and intensifying competition between the two countries, China stresses the paramount importance of ensuring the security and stability of industry and supply chains. For example, at the end of 2020, the Central Economic Work Conference proposed to enhance the autonomy and the controllable capacity of industrial chains and supply chains. The most important economic planning is the Commission, the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission, and currently stressed 4 areas of security. That is the food security, energy and resources security, industrial and the supply chain security, and financial security. That is the 4 areas which have been highlighted by the Chinese government. In March 2021, 13 ministries and agencies, including NDRC, issued a special document proposing a plan to study and enhance security of the nation's manufacturing supply chain. 8, the roles that will explore and implement projects to improve the competitiveness of manufacturing supply chain, gradually improve the key supporting systems of the supply chains of strategic energy emerging industries, and consolidate the competitiveness of core links of the manufacturing the supply chain. So in order to respond to the US securitization of interdependence and economic sanctions, China mainly adopts the following ways. The number 1, accelerate the construction of a new pattern of a domestic and international double or dual cycle circulation development to drive the sustain the growth of a Chinese economy with the domestic markets. The second point is to promote the regional economic integration and open up new space for international cooperation. In fighting the pandemic, China sees opportunities out of the adjustment of the global supply chain and use it as a weapon to strengthen the regional cooperation with Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia to speed up the talks on the RCEP and China, Japan, and Korea free trade agreement. Okay, that is part of the motions for the China be proactive promoting the RCEP and negotiations of comprehensive investment agreements with the EU. In this part, we have seen we will be that China will make efforts to emphasize the enhancement of China's industrial chain and supply chain's independence and controllability, and so on. And with the focus on intelligence, digitalization, and Internet of Things, the China will accelerate applications of new technologies, accelerate the digital transformation of industries, ensuring the development of relevant industry will always be at the forefront of the global digital industry and the supply chain. China, on the other hand, starts to build a system of laws and regulations against the foreign sanctions, apply rules to counter the tendency of the US and other countries to securitize the independence relations. These efforts started in the 2020. The Ministry of Commerce issued provisions on the list of unreliable entities and the measures for preventing improper the actual territory application of foreign laws and the measures. The Chinese government also announced the sanctions against Pompeo, Rubio, and other US officials and individuals who the wanton infringements on China's interests. And more recently, on the June 2021, the 20 sessions of the Standing Committee of the 13th National People's Congress, NPC, voted and adopted the foreign sanctions laws of the PRC. So this will be the last slides. Okay, a little bit talk about the regional and the global implications of the accelerating of the U.S.-China threat competition and its influence on the regional and the global economy. The first of all, that is very likely the collapse of economic globalizations.
Sorry, Professor
have
Wang. Sorry for interruption, but can you wrap up in 1 minute? It's already 5 minutes over your 20 minutes
Okay,
time.
yeah.
Okay.
Just 1 minute. We'll wrap up. Sorry. Yeah. There's the collapse of the globalizations. So I think all of us had the crucial moment. Right. Secondly, it's very likely to see the rise of the parallel markets. One is centered the U.S. the markets, the other will be China the market centered. And more the grim scenery is the new Cold War between the U.S. or between the countries around the U.S. and China. Even personally, I believe there will be the possibility is very low to have the new Cold War. Okay, I would like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm listening. I'm looking forward to your the comments and the opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor Wang. Okay. Now we are going to move to a next presenter, Professor Katada. Saori, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And the Professor Katada, okay, then actually I had been a sabbatical, okay, and visiting professor position at the USC 2012. So I remember that we have met together at the faculty seminar with some others, okay? It's been a long time. It's been already 10 years, okay? I can't believe it. But as you know, that the Professor Katada, she is very well known and distinguished professor in East Asian regionalism. So she published a recent book, Japan's New Regional Realities, okay, the last year, this year, I'm not sure, but anyway,
Last year, yeah.
It's great, okay, the joy, okay, to invite you and have your presentation for today's session. Okay, you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your kind introduction. And please come back to join and come back to visit us at USC. Kind of really nice to see Inju and Dr. Wan too, whom I know quite well. So let me share the screen first. Can you see it? Okay. Great. So thank you very much. This is such an honor to be on this panel with Dr. Son and Dr. Wan. Really kind of I totally agree with Dr. Wan's kind of characterization of this weaponization of interdependence to be a really important subject moving forward in the context of international political economy, especially in the Asia-Pacific or many would like to now call Indo-Pacific. Today, my task is to discuss that in the context of Japan, and I would like to somewhat limit that kind of analysis on the regional supply chains because I would argue later on that that this kind of a weaponization tactics and feasibility really depends on the issue areas of the economy. So that will be my focus. Let me talk first a little bit about a theoretical backdrop, which I feel to be a very interesting development. The economic statecraft, or the kind of ways in which the geoeconomics, or the kind of ways in which economic instruments can be used to achieve national foreign policy goals, has been in the works for a long time. And obviously, the U.S. has been the one who's been using it quite a while. In terms of the scholarship, obviously Hirschman's work back in the the 60s and 60s into the 80s, talks about the kind of analysis of the Germany taking advantage of its dominance and dependence on the part of East European countries to get their way against, kind of impose power against these regions. That's obviously kind of a seminal work. And also Baldwin in 1985 discussed various aspects of economic statecraft. And I think Dr. Song was already talking about the complex interdependence and the kind of ways in which Cohen and I talked about it in the context of the kind of triggered by, I guess, the oil crisis of 1973. So these are the kind of old or the kind of traditional way of how we look at the economic statecraft and the ways that the powerful would use their power imposed on the relatively weaker partner, especially in the form of bilateral sanctions. Meanwhile, these days, I think there are three new kind of developments in the theoretical theorizing of these kind of economic statecraft, and I would point out three here. That one is kind of a ways in which instead of just looking at the bilateral sanctions, they would be more focused on the asymmetry in the structural power of certain countries on the economic system. So, kind of not just the bilateral dynamics, but the system and international kind of overall global context or regional context is important. And somewhat, kind of in that realm, I guess, in that kind of extension of that thinking, the very high profile, well-cited, I guess, a new work by Farrell and Newman in 2019 in International Security talked about the weaponization of economic interdependence, or they will call it weaponized interdependence. So this is the kind of deployment of power by the systemically strong, by using this is kind of panopticon effect, which is like looking around systemically kind of impose this power of the being a node of the network, and also usually invoked discussion of the choke point effect. So that's really an important development in the theory of weaponization, where it's not bilateral sanctions that obviously powerful can impose on the weak, but also depending on where these countries or the government or the powerful kind of state kind of place itself on the network and nodes, that they have a particular power in imposing damage and pain on the other. And also, obviously, with the rise of China, the perpetrators are not only the powerful United States, but could be non-hegemonic powers. And I would argue, and kind of citing my own work with Cynthia Roberts and Leslie Armejo in 2017 on the BRICS, that there could be collectively worked out where some of the collective entities like the BRICS and so on could work towards some kind of influence in that context. So in this kind of theoretical development and the way that we look at economic interdependence, how do we see Japan and its economic statecraft? Obviously, if we are talking about this in 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, Japan would probably, one of the entity that could well be the weaponizer of interdependence. Helena, actually, back in late 1980s, talked about Japan's financial power could easily be weaponized. While now we are in the 2020s, and Japan is no longer that kind of position, even though it has obviously Dr. Son has already discussed extensively that occasionally Japan could try at least to impose a choke point effect on other countries, like the case of the imposition of export ban of the 3 chemicals against South Korea in 2019. But overall, my argument is that Japan is on the defense against weaponization, and especially, as I said, in the area of supply chain, that is clearly so. Again, so obviously in different issue areas, some different dynamics apply, but I think it's really important to look at some of the details or mechanisms in terms of how that's done. So for Japan, there are kind of three ways in which Japan has been working to use the economic statecraft in the context of protecting itself again on the defense against the supply chain disruption. So obviously, the first statecraft, first tactics, first kind of policies, strategies Japanese government has been using is to reshoring and diversification, or at least attempt of that against the type of weaponization, against type of the vulnerability that the Japanese economy face in the context of interdependence. Obviously, the first and very prominent example of that case is the 2010, the sanction that Japan experienced from China on the rare earth elements, where embargo was imposed vis-a-vis Japan, and that really triggered many of the rethinking in terms of the dependence and economic vulnerability. And from there forward, there is this kind of phrase where Japan talks about China plus one. So many of the firms which are significantly invested and have a significant relations, export-import relationship or investment relationship with China should also look at least another partner, could it be Vietnam or India or wherever, to either supply or to kind of produce and have a kind of inputs relationship so that it could be well diversified. And also that concern of the overdependence has been again heightened in the context of COVID crisis in obviously the last 15, 16 months, where the supply chain disruption, especially first of all in the personal protective equipment or the masks and so on and so forth, and also later on the kind of various items, including the parts and possibly, it's not really to China, but supply chains of the semiconductors and so on, has really hyped up the concerns of the diversification and reshoring. In that context, the Japanese government actually kicked in 2.9, currently actually $3.1 billion to encourage firms to reshore, so that is to bring the production back to the Japanese soil to produce, and also diversify the supply chain network away from kind of China, but basically that's not against China, but away from China to Southeast Asia as well as South Asia, including Bangladesh and India. The second phase is now just starting, so it's been quite a few companies utilizing that. Meanwhile, how much of the long-term impact that would have in actually disinvesting from Japanese company, de-investing from China into other places, or diversifying fully or reassuring back to Japan is questionable, according to many of the surveys that JETRO and various other entities conduct. Obviously, the interdependence and kind of prosperity that brings to Japan in relation to China is crucial for many of the companies, and so far there's not much kind of hype in really leaving China as its production place or the kind of major economic partner. So but at least that is one kind of ways in which Japan has been playing the defense on this kind of supply chain weaponization front. The other ways in which which is the kind of major part that I would like to discuss, is a way for Japan to be the entity, the kind of a leader in many ways of economic rule and norm making in the region. So you probably know, those who are looking at IPE, this has been a kind of bonanza time for looking at the mega free trade agreement. And let me go to the next page. to show you that the CPTPP, obviously TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, negotiated through to from 2010 into 2015, was basically shut down by the Trump administration as Trump withdrew the United States from TPP. But the remaining 11 members, led by Japan, arguably, concluded the comprehensive and progressive agreement of TPP with again, these 11 members, and that's been that has already come into effect by December of 2018. Really, yes, without United States, not as a big deal in terms of the size as with United States, but it really installed a significantly high level rules of the trade and investment in the membership countries, and it has already come into effect. Obviously, some countries have to still ratify to be on board. So this is really one kind of major accomplishment that Japan is playing defense by creating these rules that weaponization become harder. The other, I think, arguably much more impactful in terms of supply chain resilience in the region is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, among the ASEAN +5 countries, because India withdrew from it 1 year before its conclusion of in November of 2020. But this is really an important arrangement. Obviously, this is to be still being ratified among various countries, and then 3 out of 5 of the ASEAN +5 has to ratify as well as 6 of the ASEAN members. But I say there is a significant expectation that this is going to come into effect, hopefully by the end of this year. So basically, this RCEP is really an important entity for the resilience of supply chain, obviously including China in this grouping, where the cumulative rule of origin will be implemented, and this is there to support the regional supply chains that's being kind of a vibrant and really important foundation of the economic prosperity within the region. Obviously, as many people discuss, this RCEP is the first free trade agreement Japan has with both South Korea and China, and this is really important not only for the supply chain purposes, but for the trade relationship and investment relationship with these two countries. So these are the kind of rule-making instruments through free trade agreement, and that's been quite successful in terms of arriving to these mega agreement. And obviously, Japan has another one with EU currently, and then with the bilateral deal that Japan made with United States, or United States with Japan. Japan now 80% of Japanese trade is now covered by these free trade agreement, which is significant step forward from the situation that Japan was in just like 10, 15 years ago. The other kind of ways in which the same topic of the economic rulemaking, norm making in the context of defensive measures for weaponization is the use of the grouping, the coalition grouping called Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Obviously, this is kind of a pet peeve of the Prime Minister Abe, and kind of snatched or promoted by President Trump from 2016, 2017, looking at various aspects, both security and economic of the kind of regional conceptualization, including India in the grouping beyond just the Asia Pacific. And in this context, now this is really a kind of fluid concept which can kind of house many things, again, from maritime security to supply chain resilience to infrastructure investment. But in the context of supply chain, then there has been significant efforts between Japan, Australia, and India where, especially facing the COVID-19 crisis, looking at the supply chain resilience. They had a meeting back in fall of last year about this resilience effort. And now, as of April 27 this year, they have, these three countries have agreed on supply chain resilience initiative, where the trade ministers have agreed on working towards that goal. And obviously, kind of the idea, even though United States was not part of that three-member FOIP effort, in the context of the Quad Summit the United States hosted on April 12th of this year, Biden administration was quite keen on highlighting that supply chain resilience in various issues, various items, from the PPE to the semiconductors, as well as kind of rare earth type of crucial minerals for the industry. So altogether, this is these are the kind of point two are the ways in which we go back to kind of create rules, norms, and coalitions that would make the weaponization harder to implement and supply chain resilience to be highlighted in that context. And finally, the kind of mostly the kind of domestic ways in which Japan has been looking at this is to create a national security economic division within the National Security Secretariat, which was established several years earlier, but highlighting the economic security to be an important component of what Japan should implement moving forward. And also the Liberal Democratic Party has actually drafted a strategy towards that kind of economic security issue area. So defending Japan's economic interest and defending against weaponization is definitely happening on the kind of domestic institutional ground. So let's see. So where is it? Why is it happening like this? Why Japan playing defense, and kind of aspirations that Japan wants to go from here? Is that definitely for Japan, and I think kind of nice to hear Dr. Son's talk about how difficult it is to play kind of invoke or implement this choke point effect for Japan. It hasn't been successful, and it would be undermining Japan's credibility as the entity that could really push for high standard norms and rules and norms. So this will be not a very appropriate strategy. And also in many ways, and I argue in my book, which the chair already kindly introduced, that Japanese government has already it's been difficult for the Japanese government to really push the private sector, the businesses, to follow exactly the kind of strategy that the government wants to pursue. So given the kind of independence that businesses are gaining from this old kind of developmental state Japan, it's not the kind of easiest strategy to take. Also, I think the two presenters already mentioned in many ways is that collateral damage of weaponization, the kind of damage, economic damage that it creates, is quite devastating for Japan. And given that Japan is now living on the regional prosperity, not only the national prosperity, the weaponization, active use of weaponization is very damaging. Not Japan itself doing it, that's damaging too, but also if others kind of start implementing it. So avoiding that, playing defense is really important. Yeah, and I said, sorry, I already said kind of, this is really, weaponization would be damaging Japan's strategic position. Playing defense is really kind of one way that Japan could be the kind of leader, or could be an influencing entity in the context of regional economy. So, kind of new normal that's emerging in East Asia, given the possibility of weaponization, is that there is some sense of challenge to the commercial piece. Gertsky or Haggard, various people talk about the fact that East Asia has had this long peace due to the commercial relationship. While this has to be thought of somewhat differently. Obviously, hopefully this will be the kind of continuation, or that there'll be a continuation of that kind of commercial peace through interdependence. But in terms of the kind of use of weaponization might jeopardize that, while obviously all the entities are aware of that kind of a negative effect of that kind of weaponization. Meanwhile, I would like to conclude with my discussion on the kind of concern of the Kindleberger trap. This is what Nye talked about, I think from 2017, but in the Washington Quarterly 2020, where there is a power transition possibly taking place, where Thukydides' trap, the Graham Allison, is being already discussed quite widely in terms of the possibility of war, while the concern is the kind of hegemonic absence, where public goods, in terms of the rules, in terms of kind of land of last resort, many of these things will be missing from the region and beyond, and that will be something that Japan should be stepping in. Hopefully, that the Japanese government is quite aware of that, and that's where these institution building and rule making is kind of really important place. So just kind of show you, where this transition between Japan and China in terms of power, maybe combined, they should be providing significant public goods for the region. So I would like to stop with my plug, the commercial for my book, and hopefully if you have a chance to read it, that'd be great. Thank you.
And especially for maintaining your time. So now we have some 3 discussions. Because of some technical problems and some delays, I have to shorten, just a little bit for each discussion presentation. So why don't you have a 8-minute discussion, and we need time to get some response from the presenters. So the first discussion corresponding to the presenters presentation. So the Jung Sung-chul, you are the first.
I am Sung-chul Jung. I am Sung-chul Jung at Myeongjae University. I'm very happy to be here and to give comments on the Dr. Son's papers on Japan, on the paper on the title of Weapon or Default Option. So I study international security and also international relations of East Asia. So as an international security scholar, I try to give some comments on this paper and also suggest some the research, the question for Dr. Son and also for me and for all of us. So first, just I want to emphasize the importance of this study. These papers deals with the relationship between economic interdependence and international stability. So it's a long time debate on the relationship between economic cooperation and the security cooperation. So there is no the winner, I think, but still many people in international security studies they debate which comes first. So this study talks about why study choose economic sanction, what is a result of economic sanction, and also suggests one way for the economic cooperation between Japan, Korea, and East Asian states. So this is very important and also very interesting to see how we can explain the economic cooperation and security cooperation in East Asia, and also on the idea for the better East Asian relations. But the big question from this paper is the EASC, so East Asia Semiconductor Community. This idea is interesting, but is it workable and also durable? So this is the big question from this paper. So I know Dr. Song said it's very hard to realize this idea, and there are so many obstacles. But first, I want to talk about two obstacles. The first one is mistrust between East Asian states, Japan, Korea, and China. So many people talk about the East Asia is a region of the strategic rivalry and also the historic rivalry. So this big obstacle for the economic cooperation at this time. And especially in these days, we see the COVID-19 and economic trouble in each Asian country and US. So it's hard to persuade the public for the economic cooperation with other countries. And there are some mood for the protectionism and protecting domestic industry and our national laborers. So how we can overcome this mistrust and strong nationalism in East Asia. So we need to think more about it. And the second obstacle for the EASC and economic cooperation is the many players in East Asia. So in this paper, Dr. Sons, I think, talks little about the US. So how US respond to this idea, how US think about some economic cooperation among Korea, Japan, and China. Now we know that the US suggests an idea for the supply chain for semiconductors. So many people say that this idea excludes China. So US tried to be a more important, more significant player for economic cooperation between US and its security allies, the Japan and Korea and some country in Europe. So we need to think about who are major players, what roles do they play. So we need to think about who are players, who are not players. So this is our second some problem or the task for the thinking about the better economic cooperation. So just I want to suggest 4 research questions for some topics. So we need to expand our ideas and scopes. So first one is which comes first, the security cooperation and economic cooperation. So I can see many some security competition between China and US, and also between China and its neighbors. But economic cooperation can damp the security cooperation. So I'm not sure. So it's a big topic, but also we need to examine the current cases and then try to see the correlation or correlation between security cooperation and economic cooperation. The second is the outcomes of economic sanction. The Dr. Son's paper is very interesting to see the result of the Japan's sanction against South Korea. So South Korea tried to achieve the localization and diversification. So we can see some other cases. So U.S. against China, and also South Korea against North Korea, and Japan against South Korea, so China against South Korea. So we can see many economic sanction cases. So we can compare the result of the economic sanction. So as you know, there are some studies which criticize the effects of economic sanction. So economic sanction does not work. Economic sanction does not achieve their desired outcomes. So they cannot change the target's behavior, only punishment. So we can see the new cases now, the ongoing. So we can compare the outcomes and then try to think more why we need economic sanction. So why we should avoid or we should take economic sanction. The second topic is the causes of economic sanction. So what drives economic sanction? As I said, there are many current cases and recent cases, the economic sanction in East Asia. So what drives, what causes the economic sanction? Maybe some political leaders, they think about their national interests and then try to use this as a statecraft. But also, there are some domestic factors, so public opinion or some elite ideas, some other factors. So we can think more what is the problem, what is the main driving force of economic sanction. So nationalism or domestic mood or some domestic issues. So we can think about some many factors which affect the beginning of the new sanction. The last one is about vulnerability. So when we talk about economic cooperation, we think about some common interest or big interest. But for more durable and durable economic cooperation, we need to think more the vulnerability. So not only for the big interest, but also with the low vulnerability. So without we have a low vulnerability, I think we cannot start a new economic cooperation in this region. So many countries, especially the middle power and non-major powers, are seriously concerned about some vulnerability. So even if we get some benefit now, some money now, but in the near future, we can be punished at any time. So many security studies scholars say that asymmetric interdependence leads to some weaponized interdependence. So that means asymmetric interdependence decrease security cooperation. But now we need to try to pose a question, how we can decrease vulnerability resulting from economic cooperation. I think it's a big question. So without answering this question, I think it is very hard to make a more economic cooperation, especially in East Asia. Let me stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now the second discussion about the second presented paper. So we have a Son In-ju. Are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're joining the Zoom, okay? So now you have
Yes.
eight minutes to make a discussion on a Professor Wang Yong's paper.
Sure. Okay. First of all, let me express my thanks to Korean Foundation and Professor Lee Yong-i organize this wonderful panel. Let me try my best to make my question is very simple and explicit. Professor Wang did a very fine job outlining securitization of economic interdependence. I'm gonna raise some question and suggestion in the spirit of the helping articulate Professor Wang's very persuasive argument and promoting mutual learning. This morning, President Xi Jinping delivered his speech to commemorate the centennial of Chinese Communist Party and promoting a great spirit of resistance and fighting in the face of challenge, which I guess has to do with what Professor Wang called the New Cold War. So my first question is the origin of New Cold War. The paper is not explicit about the origin of Cold War, but I was under impression that it is the United States. Under the Trump administration, United States triggered the trade war and escalating tensions. And it's true, the Trump administration definitely facilitate U.S.-China competition and strategic rivalry. However, we are not completely sure it's fair to blame only United States for the emergence of what is called the new Cold War. Anti-China forces have been consistent in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere over the past decade. Meanwhile, the international business community has been relatively supportive of U.S. engagement, West engagement toward China. However, I noticed that the international community readjust its stance, change its stance on China around the year 2015-16. Some IP scholars point out that the importance of Made in China 2025, which was released in year 2015. That's quite a critical moment in which the international community, business community are becoming more critical of PRC's state-led industrial policy and less supportive of US engagement policy towards the Chinese Communist Party. The Beijing's ultimate goal of this industrial policy seems to be arguably to reduce China's dependence on foreign technology and foreign intermediate goods that really concerned many multinational corporations who benefit greatly from the existing global supply chain. So I'm curious whether and to what extent the China's economic policy, especially nationalist industrial policy, might be responsible for the emergence of new Cold War. Second point I want to make is the notion of decoupling. This needs to be unpacked. There are different types of decouplings. Maybe we need more nuanced understanding of decoupling in the public debates. And I think today's globalized world, complete decoupling is a joke. It's impractical and impossible. I think very few policymakers are really serious about the idea of complete decoupling. What we heard more frequently here is selective decoupling and managed decoupling. So we have to differentiate the different type of decoupling. And on a related point, also it might be useful to differentiate the rhetoric from the actual policy behavior, deed. So rhetoric versus deed. And a lot of policymakers, politicians seems to be threatened to decouple as a means to pursue certain policy goal. So we have to carefully look at what actually really happened. So that's my suggestion about the differentiated rhetoric versus deed. And also it will be more interesting to elaborate on the financial statecraft today's in the globalized world. As you know, President Trump and like President Biden is giving a lot of pressure on China to open Chinese financial market. Some realists speculate Beijing is also partly motivated by its own geopolitical concerns. China wants to preempt possible US financial sanction in the context of worsening relations. So if you integrate into global financial market, accelerate coupling by opening to foreign players, then you reduce US leverage. So I'm curious, in other words, realists believe that the bigger the pie China tempt Wall Street with, the more likely China can use Wall Street to lobby for softer policy from the Washington. So I'm curious how Professor Wang and maybe react to this kind of assertion and hypothesis. Another point I want to make the question is the issue of dual-use technology. Professor Wang mentions and very aptly noted that the one possible outcome is the United States will lead to tighten restriction on technology in defense and defense industry, mostly closely related to military technology, but loosen restriction on the export of technology products in non-military related technology sector to give American companies more room to develop in China. This observation is quite plausible. But my question is it? It's not easy to draw a clear line between military-related technology and completely commercial use of technology, because a lot of technology has a dual purpose, dual uses. That's the points I want to make. And also this paper sort of reminds of the debates about the China's new self-reliance strategy. International scholars quite divided about the prospect of China's high-tech development and indigenous innovation in general. There's some pessimist view and optimist view is going to compete. Some pessimist views point out that China still lags behind in most core technology and advanced manufacturing fields, such as high-end chips. There have been several real breakthroughs in the semiconductor sector by private companies such as HiSilicon and also other development. But nonetheless, these state-sponsored technology innovation and breakthroughs have been crippled and slowed down by existing problems in China's science technology research system, and also the campaign-style catch-up strategy that rewards sort of bureaucracy and short-term goals. Nevertheless, meanwhile, there's more optimistic about China's sort of self-reliance strategy, and that those school of thoughts point out recent development in China's so-called military civil fusion strategy, Jinrong Runghe, military civil fusion. This new model maybe helped China boost the facilitated innovation. So I'm curious how Professor Yong look at this kind of debate. Another point is the implication of China's use of unilateral sanction. The Professor Yong paper noted that the recent Chinese authority adopted the anti-foreign sanction law. This is quite interesting development, and which is also quite understandable. China wants to defend itself by using more coercive means against other aggressive behavior. But we are curious about the implication of this kind of China new unilateral sanction option, which can this use of unilateral sanction can have deterrent effects, create a balance of fear that might contributing stability of economic order in East Asia, or it might be leading to more vicious cycle of measurement, counter-measurement, and like an arms race. So it's pretty interesting development, I will see it. And another point, this paper did not discuss the role of a third-party country, especially the key manufacturing players in advanced industry, such as Germany and Japan and South Korea. So I think these kind of industrialized countries, the choice and strategy also has a huge implication for U.S.-China economic rivalry competition. And my final point is it will be more interesting and rich if you can also discuss the role of non-state actors in this dynamics. And the recent Brookings paper conducts some survey on the global tech executives' view on U.S.-China tech competition. And their finding is that global technology industry hedging its bets. So as U.S. and China compete for technology supremacy, global high-tech companies do not plan to pick any side. Rather, they pragmatically aim to compete in both Chinese ecosystem and U.S. ecosystem, regardless of the extra cost and complexity involved. Even though these multinational corporate executives regard as inevitable that the American-Chinese technological sphere influence will, to some extent, separate, they also expect Chinese systems and solution suppliers to continue to rely on globally sourced technology rather than Chinese developed technology. So it would be nice if you can can incorporate the role of ninth actor into the dynamic picture of U.S.-China economic competition. Okay, let me start here.
Okay, thank you. Now the final discussant, Jung Hyun-ju.
Hello, my name is Hyun-ju Jung from Yonsei University. And it's my pleasure to read Professor Katata's paper and discuss about it. And in fact, we met maybe also 10 years ago when she was working on a book project on financial statecraft, and I was invited discussant for that. I also met in several occasions. But I'm glad to see you. You are looking healthy in the context of COVID-19. And I think it's a really interesting and paper in a short, even if it's a very short paper, it covers very complex issues, covering the relation between the security and economy in nexus from the Japan side. If I run the risk of simplification, I think her argument is two. One is the economic interdependence becoming increasingly weaponized. On the second, Japan is under defense. Let me, because of time constraint, let me just focus on 2 or 3 points that I think are really important, but is not covered or taken seriously in her paper. One is the second argument, Japan is under defense. I agree, Japan's policies is largely on defense, but even if Japan's policies can be taken as defensive, economic statecraft, as the author maintains, they can be taken or regarded by neighboring countries like China as offensive. So real or imagined. So maybe it can be called as economic security dilemma, if I may say. And then one missing actor in Professor Katata's paper is, I think, Taiwan. Recent events that may show Japan's defensive move, but taken as offensive by China, might be Japan's growing and more overt connection with China, Taiwan, as Professor Son already mentioned in his paper about the Japanese government decision to strengthen its ties with Taiwan in high tech. Japan, as you know, signed off on, I think, about 37 billion yen semiconductor research project to develop cutting-edge chip technology in Japan with Taiwan's TSMC. And as far as I know, about 20 Japanese firms are invited to take part in this project. And it also connects to the Professor Wang's point about China's industrial policy. I think one key component in every 3 papers is industrial policy. Old style industrial policy, but in Japan's case, very new kind of components, which is traditional industrial policies for domestic firms, right? Japan's government trying to help the national competitiveness of semiconductor industry of Japan, but with a new actor of Taiwan, right? Taiwan's TSMC is helped by Japan's government. So I think if you take a slight look at Japan's kind of new industrial policy in a new dimension, I think it might be more interesting, not just about the regional trading arrangement. And then also, even if Japan is under defense, I think as the Professor Son mentioned, it may be boomeranged, kind of tit for tat issues, right? As I think I read just today's newspaper, because of the sanction by Japan, South Korea tried to internalize the supply chain. So therefore, the components, parts, equipments, and its dependence on Japan in terms of these kind of areas reduced substantially from 33 percentage point in 2017, and now it dropped to about 25%. So radically, South Korea became independent from Japan's in that area. And then also, I think it's really interesting to see about the connection between the economy and security. But one missing point in the era of this time is information. Let me just take an example. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first example you mentioned in the paper about Japan's defensive statecraft, which was Japan's response to the Chinese government ban on exports of rare earth elements in response to Senkaku Daiyodao island disputes between the two countries, right? You mentioned in the paper. But in fact, this event also led to the legislation of the Act on Protection of Specially Designated Secrets. In Korean, it's a 특별 비밀 보호법. And then at that time, in 2010, I think so, at that time there's an online leak of a video showing a collision between the Chinese fishing boats, vessels, and Japan's naval ship near the disputed Senkaku Daioda Island in 2007, heavily reported. And it is generally considered to have provided strong impetus, motivations to create this secrecy law. The law itself is the act aims to prevent unauthorized disclosure of such information by providing for the designation, Article 1, designation of specially designated secrets, restrictions on the persons who handle them, and other necessary matters with regard to the protection of such information, and to thereby contribute to the securing the safety of Japan as its citizen. This law has been very heavily politicized in 2013 and 14 when it became implemented. It's more politicized than Koizmi's Japan Post privatization. There's many demonstrations about this law, but more important is not just law itself. There is a lot of human rights issues, that kind of, but its implications for security and economic cooperation. I can hardly tell more detail, but one thing is there's a closer relationship because of this kind of information secrecy law between the Five Eyes, the intelligence community, Five Eyes countries, and Japan. And there's a CSIS have some reports by Armitage and Joseph Nye, and these two guys in their reports even argued that there should be efforts to make Six Eyes, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and UK, including Japan, Six Eyes network which is published in last December. So which means there's growing kind of information, intelligence, cooperation between the like-minded countries, which includes very sensitive information about the technology, that kind of stuff, because the authorities can designate certain information as secrets, which should not be kind of go outside. And also it is reported that Japanese researchers and engineers are more actively collaborate with government and defense industry. This is a kind of new phenomenon in Japan, I think. And researchers, scholars, and universities who had been reluctant to cooperate and collaborate with government agencies, especially in the defense ministries, because they didn't want to be viewed as doing so. But because of now collaboration with defense industry become less burdensome, because defense-related researches can be specially designated as secret. So I read some articles and some papers that Japan's collaboration with among this kind of private and public collaboration in terms of defense ministry, more sensitive kind of, as Professor said, the kind of dual-use technology is increasing. And also the cross-country or interstate cooperation in terms of this area is increasing as well. I think to sum up, I think the Professor Kadada's research can be much broader in scope, not just about trade issues or supply chain policies or resilience, but also foreign policies, foreign aid policies, and also industrial policies and public diplomacy, one said about the public opinion, and also intelligence policies. So I think the key terms I hope you can emphasize in your kind of revision is the new types of industrial policy of Japan to try to connect not just about their Japanese domestic firms, but also Taiwanese or the firms of like-minded countries. So like-minded countries are increasingly more complex interdependence, and they can be more weaponized. And then in that sense, I think this new phenomenon seems to be really interesting. But also at the same time, to better understand the current phenomena, I strongly suggest that we need to understand not just about the economy, manufacturing, all that kind of stuff, but also the information, the key information and intelligence, how these are connected with more securitized and weaponized. And I really enjoy reading your paper and presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chung. I failed to manage this session on time, so but we have to listen to some answers and responses from the presenters. So I'll just give 2 minutes, for each presenter. I'm very sorry for this, but so don't try to answer all those questions raised by discussant. Just to pick just 1 or 2 key questions and keep your time, in 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. Now we are going to go to some reverse order. So from Professor Katada, you are the first to answer this.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. John, for a wonderful discussion on my paper, and then I'm grateful for giving me another ideas for my another book, I guess, maybe the next one, if I can. So there is a lot of interesting things to chew on, but just quickly on kind of both points. One, kind of this economic the kind of defensive offensive is a really kind of crucial one, and I think I probably should do a bit more on applying some security thinking on my work, but so that's kind of well taken. Well, I think it's really important, and I hope I kind of emphasize that the weaponization actually has a boomerang effect, and that's kind of a ways in which Japan is trying to play defense because danger of sanction and stuff like that, which has been a quite important component. So I would like to kind of emphasize that this is really a key part of what I would like. I try to discuss in the paper. The second part about this information, I fully agree with you that that's really crucial component, crucial point. I was trying to kind of have a bit more contained discussion about certain aspect of the weaponization, because obviously there are many elements that comes in, and obviously that kind of security component, dual use, the kind of technology, all that is a critical part, and that was a bit beyond my the scope of what I was looking at, and obviously the paper itself is pretty short, but obviously it's really important kind of another side that one should clearly think about in looking at looking at the dynamics. So I agree that this if I'm to kind of put it in a kind of broader scope, then this will be a very important part of what I need to look into. But thank you very much for the discussion.
Now back to Professor Wang. It's your turn for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to thank you, Professor Lee, for the organize this very important panel. I think we have here a lot of insights. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Professor Sun for the very rich and wonderful discussion. Yeah, so that you touch a lot of interest point. Okay, that is also things, the topics I'd like to have more thoughts on it to produce more papers. You mentioned, that is CPC, the Communist Party of China, celebrating its centennial today. This is very important. Put our discussion in a historical context. I'm happy to say, in the leaders' the remark. I think China will continue to be committed to the opening up, and especially to emphasize the mainstream, the political ideas, the values. That is elaborated in that remark. That is very important. That's a part of the responses to the skepticism, on China's rising. So I think that's very important. Secondly, I think China will continue its growth. China set a target, right? So that is by 2025, China, determined to achieve the second centennial the goal. that China will reach, or we will become a middle-level developed country. So I think that is that goal is shared widely in China. China will continue to depend on the resources, the talents, and the capital and technology, of the global, economy. Okay, there's no doubt about that. So that we have, so I see a lot of misunderstanding and misperceptions between the U.S. and China, China and the other countries. So I think that is a great opportunity for us, our scholars, to work together to help, to understand each other better, to find a way. Okay, the last point. I'm cautiously optimistic. U.S.-China can escape, the Cold War, and all the so-called Thucydides trap. Yeah, because a lot of common grounds, common interests between the two. So I think the middle powers. So if that is okay to use this concept like Korea, or even a lot, a more powerful country like Japan or others, can play a very constructive role in bridging the gap, not just to take sides between the with the either one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Son.
Okay, thank you very much for your insightful discussion of my paper. And actually, we are on the same boat because I don't think the possibility of creating or promoting East Asian semiconductor community is possible at the moment because of the structural reasons you mentioned. Basically, if we want to include Taiwan, China will oppose it. If we include the United States, we want to include China, then United States will oppose it. So there is a structural constraint actually preventing the possibility. And also there is a high level of, animosity, antagonism between the neighboring countries. So these two variables are actually operating negatively to the creation of East Asian semiconductor community. So basically, pooling our resources, manpower, technologies, and our manufacturing capacity is really difficult. But as a scholar, what we can do is actually to tap the rich resources of history, especially the miraculous moments of European integration, just right after the World War II. And basically, these French diplomats like Schuman and Jean Monnet devised the idea of a European coal and steel community at the time of a crisis, in a sense. And also, basically, there was, in a sense, we can say there's a favorable structural environment because United States was promoting some kind of anti-communist networks, so promoting Franco-German cooperation. So what I'm saying here is basically, things are changing. We might be see better international structure unfolding in the future. When the window of opportunity opens in the future, and we have able diplomats, people like Jean Monnet, then perhaps we can move further into the phase of regional integration. Thank you very much. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all three presenters and discussants. Okay, as some concluding and wrapping remarks. Okay, I want to say that this topic, okay, interdependence, how that not just simple economic logic or the economic, okay, but more political security or non-economic factors intervene in these economic relations, international economic relations. That is the very topic that most IP studies, okay, that the studies of interaction between politics and economy at the international level. And that is the IP's contribution and some meaning meaningful, the discussion in the studies of international relations as well as international economics. So from that aspect, so I think that this panel, today's topic is very timely and very relevant and very intriguing and important one. So I want to appreciate the Korea Foundation for supporting this session, as well as Professor Lee Young-wook, who organized this session, including some international and some other scholars. And I believe that today's discussion, today's paper is mainly based on representing some early stages of the study, mostly based on fact-finding, gathering data, and trying to keep track of what's happening right now in the region and at the global level. So we still collectively study further to find out more theoretical and more sophisticated empirical studies, as well as we need to find out some reasonable and some reliable policy recommendations that everyone actually try to avoid the danger of a weaponization of these economic relations. So thank you everyone, especially from Japan and China, and also the discussion from today's session. Thank you very much, and let's wrap up this session right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Very nice to see you here.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.